Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this timely webinar with Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin discussing annexation and the erosion of Israeli democracy. My name is Adina Vogel-Ayalon, and I am J Street's Israel Director. Today, we find ourselves one day away from the July 1st date that has been etched into our minds in this struggle to prevent unilateral annexation. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin with us today to make sense of this current moment and to help us understand how the issue of annexation fits into the bigger picture narrative regarding the state of Israel's democracy and its standing abroad. Dahlia knows this, but she is one of my favorite policy experts in the field because she is really truly an expert on so many topics, not only an expert but also a very insightful analyst, topics including the conflict, democracy, human and civil rights, minorities, and many, many more. I'm always waiting for an opportunity to read the next piece that she writes, be it a short op-ed or a longer research paper, or to listen to her on the Tel Aviv Review podcast that she hosts, or being interviewed on Israeli or international news. Not only is Dahlia a public opinion expert, she is also an international political strategist and consultant. She has advised countless electoral and civil society campaigns in Israel and in dozens of countries abroad. She holds a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University and has taught there as well. She is a founder and columnist at 972 magazine, a policy fellow at Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and a non-resident policy fellow at the Century Foundation. And there's many more aspects of Dahlia's bio that I could elaborate on for the full hour of this webinar, but I will stop there and say that I really appreciate you being with us, Dahlia. These are especially busy times and also especially uncertain times. And there's a lot of questions that we have still today. And I'm really looking forward to having this opportunity to sort of dive in on some of those issues with you. So for our viewers, we will start with a moderated discussion that will help us understand what annexation means for Israel at home and abroad. And we will touch on the following topics. One, where things stand today on June 30th and the potential scenarios for what we can expect in the coming weeks, days, or months. Two, the state of Israel's democracy and how it relates to the issue of annexation. And three, how annexation has the potential to impact Israel's foreign relations. I encourage all of our viewers to put their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will have the chance to ask Dahlia your questions during the second half of this discussion. So I'm going to turn to you, Dahlia, for the first question, which I will pose to you, which is really the opportunity to provide us with a general update of where things stand right now, both regarding the Israeli government's plans and the US position, and what potential annexation scenarios could look like.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Thank you for this very kind introduction, probably too kind. And thank you to everybody who is joining the call. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The Israeli public doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The Palestinian public doesn't know. The Israeli Knesset doesn't know. And most of the Israeli governing coalition doesn't know. When you consider that a large portion of the Israeli governing coalition is blue and white, who have been at various times almost embarrassingly pushed out of the discussions. But I also am not entirely sure that Netanyahu himself has had a very clear vision in his head about what to do. And I think that over the last number of days, we're all being fed on a series of rumors and hints and commentary. So there's no way to know exactly what will happen, but it looks now like, I'm happy to go into background about what the options were, but I want to just start with what we are likely to see tomorrow, at least by everything that we're hearing and seeing, is that it looks like there will be some sort of step that is much less dramatic and bombastic than, the worst case scenarios. If you're opposed to annexation, they're worst case scenarios, or best case scenarios if you're for it. We are not looking at major territorial statements of major territorial acquisition. We're probably not looking at the Jordan Valley or the 30% promised by the Trump plan. if anything, maybe smaller portions of specific settlements or areas around Jerusalem. But even at this point, because there's been such a kind of tight fist over anything related to maps, it sounds like we're probably going to see something declarative about an intention tomorrow. And so first of all, in terms of territory, I think there's a scaling back. In terms of mechanism, we could have seen government, adopt a policy and declare a policy. We could have seen the beginning of a legislative process. But it looks like right now what we're going to see is some sort of individual declaration of intention from Netanyahu. And the only reason I imagine it might be individual is because up until now, Gantz has not really been part of the conversations. The other, of course, unknown is exactly what the American position is. The Americans have gone essentially back and forth about whether to allow Israel to annex territory now or later, or how much, or with what level of advancing on this kind of peace process that doesn't exist, or they've been a little bit divided amongst themselves, different members of the Trump team. But I think the major point to understand about the American role is to take a step back and say the fact is these conversations are all happening between Netanyahu and the American government. They're not really happening between different partners in the Israeli coalition. They're definitely not a dialogue with the Israeli public. And most importantly, they're not in dialogue with Palestinians for all sorts of reasons that we mostly know. So that's where things stand. Now, do you think we need background on how we got to this point, or is everybody up to speed?
I think we've touched on a lot of the background. I would
good.
like if you could, you touched on the sort of territorial potential scenarios for territory and how that's changed. If you want, or could show some maps that people could have somewhat of an understanding of what is not going to happen, and to sort of just understand those potential.
Yeah, I think it's important, even though they may not happen tomorrow, because what happens tomorrow might be a declaration that the intention is to do them. And these declarations have been made before. So because they're in the public, they've been announced publicly over the course of the last year, I think it is worth knowing, because they also will understand the geopolitics of what this means for the region. So yeah, I will share a couple of slides that show exactly what areas we're talking about. Okay. Let me just start with what I consider to be a benchmark, and that's the basic outline for the two-state solution. I think it's important to keep this in mind as we talk about, the maps. We'll see how far we've gone from the days when this was the understood, the general, maybe not a total consensus, but we think of it as the paradigmatic approach to resolving the conflict, which was considered the two-state solution as worked out under the Camp David Accords and then further elaborated by the Geneva Initiative. You can see this map is taken from the Geneva Initiative. And as you can see here, all of these areas of the West Bank were to go to a Palestinian state. The blue areas were to come under Israeli sovereignty by agreement. Okay, I really don't like the use of the term annexation, because the definition of annexation is acquiring territory by force. And if it's by force, almost by definition, it's unilateral. So if this would have been an agreement, a two-state agreement, you could call it a territorial swap, because these areas of the Negev would go to the Palestinian state, etc. Okay, so it's really a land swap, and these areas by agreement would become part of the other side. These parts would go to Israel. These are the areas, neighborhoods of Jerusalem, areas like Gush Etzion, some areas close to the Green Line. All of this would become a Palestinian state, etc. That's where we started. Now, what happened was, going back to last April, okay, you have to go about a year back. Netanyahu made the statement to Israeli news that the next term, after the April elections, he thought there would be another term right away, we will begin to extend Israeli sovereignty incrementally, he said the word gradually, over Judea and Samaria in his language. And he referred to settlements and said, and I won't distinguish between the large blocks and the individual settlements. So he basically promised to extend sovereignty over all of the settlements. And I'm showing you here where all of the settlements are located. Okay, this is a map that is based on Google, but taken from the website of Settlement Watch, the project run by Peace Now. And you can see that the red dots represent Israeli settlements. Okay, you don't have to memorize the map, but the point is to notice their contours and how they both go along the Green Line, cut across the West Bank with clusters outside Jerusalem, and all around the Jordan Valley. Okay, that's what Netanyahu said as his statement of intention last April. Then he made this increasingly clear in September when he released his plan to annex the Jordan Valley. Now, that didn't cancel the previous plan, but it was almost like making a more concrete proposal for how to begin the process of annexing settlements. Okay, this is the Jordan Valley. It's just a blown up version of what you see here. Okay, which is important, of course, because it's Israel's border with Jordan. It's not the border is here, but or the border is, well, let's see, get my border is here, but this is a big, thick strip of land that cuts into the West Bank. When Netanyahu was asked on May 28th if the plan to annex the Jordan Valley would include making the Palestinians there into Israeli citizens, he said, no, they don't have to be citizens. We don't have to annex Jericho. So, of course, there are clusters of Palestinians in Jericho, and his idea was that we wouldn't annex it, therefore they wouldn't have to become citizens, but you can see that they would be, you can see very well that they would be surrounded by Israeli annexed territory. So the question is, what does not annexing them actually mean? And then finally, we have the Trump plan. So you can see how drastically it differs from the two-state solution as envisioned by the Geneva Accords, because basically what you have here is all of this area would be annexed. And here I'm using the term consciously because when this plan was announced, of course, Netanyahu stated that it was an approval for unilateral annexation to start now. And the Trump administration basically sat there and smiled at the time. Then there was later a little bit of a dispute as to whether this really meant, you know, immediate annexation or not. But the idea is that these territories that basically, you know, create this funnel of Israeli sovereign territory cutting right through the West Bank and including all of the Jordan Valley, that thick band, and cutting through the West Bank at various points, north, south over here, west to east over here, west to east over here, even sort of, you know, curling up inside what very, very conditionally and very much in the future could become a Palestinian state. This is the reason why the security establishment is not happy about this map. You know, you have Israeli enclaves surrounded by Palestinian territory. The Palestinians are not happy about it, as they haven't been happy about most things with the Trump administration, but because they say this wouldn't be a state. It's completely surrounded by Israel in all ways and completely non-contiguous. There'd be no way for them to have cohesive, contiguous land. Gaza is cut off, you know, smaller. There are no additional lands around there except for these discontiguous areas. So that's how far I would say we've gotten from the original two-state idea. And this is what we have this is where we started the debate over annexation in its most current iteration. So when we've been talking, ever since the coalition agreement said, Article 29 said that from July 1st, the government can advance annexation, no, they said advance sovereignty, of course, along the lines of the Trump plan in coordination with the Americans can put before the government or the Knesset, leaving it very vague. The starting point was settlements or the Jordan Valley or some version of this measure of Israeli territory, of Israeli annexation of this territory, which is supposed to be 30%. So the discussions up from that point until now have all been around whether it will be Jordan Valley, settlements, 30% of the West Bank, or something less. And at this point, again, it looks like it will be something less, but that something less could be a declaration of how the government intends to proceed in the coming phase, whatever that phase is.
Thanks, Dahlia. That's very helpful. And we've also been very focused on our messaging regarding how, you know, any annexation is still annexation, right? You know, even though we're moving away from this Trump map of the 30%, you know, any type of small step, a declarative intention, and then the actual follow through on that intention is still annexation. And I very much appreciate the one thing that you've been emphasizing, whereas, you know, we've been talking about unilateral annexation as if any type of annexation is not unilateral. All annexation is unilateral inherently in the term. So all of it is problematic in our view. So I really appreciate you like putting this, you know, territorial into perspective for us. And we've already gotten some questions, and you did reference about how the discussion regarding annexation really has been between, Netanyahu and the American government, and it has not included the Israeli public. And there have been several polls released recently regarding Israeli public support or opposition for annexation. Just yesterday, there was another poll that came out saying that 69% of the Israeli public, Jews and Arabs, oppose annexation. There have been polls from Commanders for Israel Security, the Geneva Initiative, the Israeli Democracy Institute. I would love if you could, as a public opinion expert, help us make sense of all of these polls, and if there's some sort of bottom line that we can conclude from these polls that have been released recently.
Yeah, let me start with the bottom line. The bottom line is that there have been many polls, as you pointed out. Most of them are asking very different things because so much of this is unknown. They've been asking them in very different ways. Okay, each pollster has a slightly different methodology, and we have to make lots of decisions about language and question methodology. And yet there are some rather interesting consistencies. The most interesting consistent finding from my perspective is that none of them show an absolute majority of Israelis in favor of any of these plans. None of them that I've seen in the last 3 months. And before that, I'm hard pressed to find any in the last phase, any in the last 6 months as well. So that's an interesting point itself. Now, you could look at it from the other perspective and say at the same time, they all show a plurality who support something like what is being tested. And what's being tested tends to be around the areas that I talked about. The more narrow the territorial aspect, there's usually a little bit higher support. And I will show some numbers in a minute, but I want you to keep those basic aspects in mind. And the reason why support is at a plurality. So usually support has ranged between 45 and 50% for some of these plans. Again, never an absolute majority among the total Israeli public, but more than those who oppose. And those who oppose regularly are about 1/3 of most surveys. You might be asking yourself, what about the rest? Okay, and the rest don't know. And I think that's a very legitimate and honest response from Israelis indicating the confusion about the policy, the lack of detail, and the lack of understanding about the implications, as well as one more very important finding that is common to all the surveys, which is that annexing the parts of the West Bank are extremely low priority for the Israeli public. Different polls from completely different bodies who commissioned them have asked this in completely different ways, and every time, it's the highest I've seen is 4% who say it should be a top government priority. In an open question by the Israel Democracy Institute, it was well below 1%. Let me show you a couple of slides to illustrate some of the interesting questions, and then I'll give you a little bit of a scoop. So let's see, we're back with the map. Okay, okay. I like, this slide I find particularly interesting because I summarized the data that was kindly sent to me, without any attempt to restrain it by the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, which is quite a right-wing think tank established by Ephraim Minbar, who left Bar Ilan, who was at Bar Ilan, maybe still is at Bar Ilan University, a well-known, advocate of right-wing positions. And they did a survey of the whole Israeli public, a small survey, but they asked pretty detailed stuff. When they asked about annexing just the Jordan Valley, and they talked about extending sovereignty, using the right-wing language, only the right-wing language of extending sovereignty, exactly like I said, 42% supported it, 27% opposed. You could say, well, it's 20 points more, almost 20 points more, and nearly 1/3 in this case didn't know. 31% said they didn't know. When they asked about annexing Ma'ale Adumim and Gush Etzion, and they added some bonus points, some booster points in this particular question, saying this is the Israeli government's plan, it has the support of the US government. Even still, as you can see, they managed to get just 50% exactly, and 25% who were opposed, and another quarter who don't know. So still, even when we're talking about just two, settlement areas, they still only managed to get 50% of the total Israeli public. That number was higher among the Jewish population, but still didn't go beyond 60%. I think it was maybe 56 or 58% or something. When they asked about all Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria with the same booster points of Israeli government plans in support of the US government, all settlements, only 43% supported it. Again, 1/3 opposed, 1/4 didn't know. And then they asked a question with a completely different methodology. They said, do you agree or disagree with a statement, a position statement that Israel must extend sovereignty to the neighborhoods around Jerusalem, okay, considered to be consensus. They named the neighborhoods to the north, west, and south of Jerusalem, and only 48% of Jews even agreed, but 43% of the total population, which is surprising to me, especially given that they are a right-wing organization. Now, how did they deal with this? They said, well, we're going to look only at the Jewish population, and then we'll just get rid of all the people who don't know and count the percentage only from those who have an opinion. Okay, so that's, I think, an artificial way of looking at it. Meanwhile, at the same time, the Israel Democracy Institute, also in late April, early May, asked a long question which described exactly the language of the coalition agreement with all the vagueness that it involves. And then they said, this is exactly how clause, I think it was clause 29, described the policy. And they said, on these terms, do you support or oppose applying sovereignty in the near future? Once again, only 45% supported. I find this strikingly close to the numbers in the JISS survey. And the IDI is considered, the Israel Democracy Institute, is somewhat of a liberal-leaning outfit. Again, 52% of Jews. Okay, so you've got a bare majority of Jews, but it's the whole population that counts in my analysis. And then among those who were, again, 1/3 who were opposed. Another more recent poll, I think, went to great lengths to try to show stronger numbers, and that's because it's run by a crony of Netanyahu, is a guy named Shlomo Filber. Those of you who are following might know that he eventually ended up testifying against Netanyahu in his investigations, but he's not really a pollster, and he's very much aligned with Netanyahu. So he said, what do you think should be the range of sovereignty and the range of area to be annexed to Israel based on the Trump plan? Well, then he gave 3 different areas where people could choose an annexation territory. And the closest one to the Trump plan, Jordan Valley and the Israeli settlements, again, got 42%. A smaller portion would choose just one or the other. So if you put those 3 responses together, naturally you have a higher number, but still 39% oppose it, which is, again, consistent with roughly 1/3 or even higher who oppose it. And then they asked a rather strange question in my mind, saying, from what you know of the Trump plan, no details, compared to other plans, no details. How would you describe the Trump plan? I highlighted the words I think indicate 3 positive responses and 1 really extreme bad response. And if you add the best, good, and tolerable response, guess what? You can claim that 64% of Israelis support it. But that, to my mind, is the only way I've seen anybody get a majority. At the same time, we have contradictory data. Oh, what happened to my screen? Where'd it go? Hold on. I'm going to bring it back up briefly. Just to show you a survey that came out yesterday, which was conducted by an organization called Accord, an academic institute. And they asked very simple questions saying, to what extent do you support Israel unilaterally annexing to its territory parts of the West Bank? Sorry, that's an awkward direct translation from Hebrew. Only 31% supported it, 69% were against. And I think that is because the question offered no details except for the focus on unilateralism. Okay. So that shows that, without knowing anything about it, the unilateral element has kind of seeped into the public discourse as something bad. And now I will give you the most important part of this, which is the scoop, because you're all loyal J Street listeners. And that's a survey that I conducted, which I just got the data so recently, I didn't have time to make a slide yet. But I'll tell you what I did, which is something that, as you can see from these surveys, nobody else has done. And that is that I finally said, okay, I know that 1/4 or higher, 1/4, 30% of Israelis don't know. They are confused. But it's a day before, okay, it's a day before July 1st, and I want to know what happens if we force them to choose. So I gave a survey question that offered only a binary option, and I did not let them choose a don't know response. And instead of pretending that I know the details, I offered a brief summary of the best of arguments in favor of annexation, the stuff we're hearing every day from the right wing, and the best of arguments against annexation, the stuff that the opposition has been saying. And I said, having heard these 2 positions, do you find yourself much more or somewhat more supportive of annexing parts of the West Bank right now? And I used also the term extending sovereignty and Judea and Samaria, or do you much more or somewhat more oppose it? And what I found was a shockingly similar response. 48% of all Israelis supported it, and 52% opposed it. In other words, all the people who might have gone into the don't know camp ultimately chose to oppose it, which I found pretty striking. Of course, when I publish it, I'll get accused of being a left-wing pollster, but I can't manufacture the numbers. They are very clearly broken down by, 3/4 on the right who support it, 80 to 85% on the left who oppose it, and the center, as they always do, are about 2/3 opposed. That's where the Israeli public is.
Thank you, Dahlia. I think that's really helpful because we definitely get a lot of questions trying to understand and make, to really digest all of this data that's being thrown at us, and to understand, is the government actually promoting something that is the will of the people, and something that the people actually understand and can comprehend. I want to sort of shift gears to discuss now sort of the state of Israel's democracy, and was hoping that you could share some of the trends that we're witnessing regarding the erosion of Israeli democracy. And you've been writing about this, and I really love if you could put out explain this thesis as to how you see the two issues really relate to one another, the erosion of Israeli democracy and the issue of annexation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it sounds, I think maybe for some people it's intuitive, and for me, it might also sound counterintuitive. But let me just start chronologically. The annexation debate began to heat up around 2012, ahead of the 2013 elections, which was the first time Naftali Bennett ran on a platform of annexing. He published a platform advocating the annexation of Area C. The nature of Israel's democracy, the depth of Israeli democracy prior to 2009 is debatable. Israel has never, ever, except for 6 months in its entire history, has never had a phase when it wasn't controlling a certain part of its subjects under martial law. Okay, except for 6 months between the end of the military government over Arab citizens and the start of the Six-Day War. So I'm leaving that aside for now. But from around 2009, when Netanyahu came back into power, what we saw was a series of more explicit legislation that began to erode basic aspects of Israeli democracy in a few particular ways that I'll focus on. The most obvious, I think, is weakening the attacks on the Supreme Court, which then expanded into attacks in general on the Israeli judiciary. All of this long predates Netanyahu's investigations. And those attacks came in various ways. They were rhetoric, they were attempts from the previous justice minister under the Olmert government to weaken the Supreme Court. And then they graduated to attempts to legislate an override clause to try so that the Knesset could override the court. And alongside a narrative that the court is a dictatorship against the real people, classic populism. That was going on from the early 2000s. Attacks on the left wing, political dissenters, I should say, have been going on in a much more vicious way since that same time. And that, again, took mainly the form of rhetorical attacks coming from the highest levels, but also legislative attacks. When I say legislative attacks, I mean passing laws to constrain the role of civil society, particularly NGOs associated with left-wing causes, with human rights related violations in the territories, in the West Bank and Gaza. And these laws were tailored in ways that they would apply only to those civil society organizations. All of this weakens and intimidates the space for political opposition in Israel. There are several laws like that. I won't go into each one. Also during the same time, during the same decade, I should say, we have somewhat more subtle, but still attempts by the Netanyahu government to delegitimize the role of the media, make life hard for the Channel 1, which was the state-run media, breaking up the old Israel Broadcast Authority and establishing and trying to kind of stymie the establishment of a new privately run authority. Weakening and criticizing Channel 10 to the point of putting financial pressure on them, which is now broken up into 2 different channels, which was considered a more critical and somewhat more left-leaning television channel. So these were not quite as open as the legislation, but still attacks on the media. And I think the most important development during that time, and specifically from the 2009 Knesset term up until 2013 was a new layer, a new level of attacks on the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel. Again, rhetorical levels, open campaigning against them, through to legislation that some of which passed, some of which wasn't ever really passed. I mean, there were laws to limit the volume of the muezzin. There were, laws that never really passed, but they legitimized the idea of intimidating this community. And of course, there's things like the Nakba law and the boycott law. But I think that, the most important is the culmination of that attack in 2018 with the passage of the nation-state law. But remember, the debate over the nation-state law goes back to the early part of the last decade. So it was, being legitimized that whole time. Now, why are these related to annexation? This is probably the question people are asking. I am not a conspiracy theorist, mostly. I don't really think that this was all some great big grand design. But I do think that when you weaken the space for political opposition, where does political opposition take place? Well, it doesn't take place in the government. It takes place among the opposition parties in Knesset. And during all of that time, executive power is slowly being consolidated over the courts and the Knesset. It takes place in the media, and the media is being increasingly delegitimized. Many of the battles against state policy are fought in the Supreme Court, often sitting as the High Court of Justice. And of course, through NGOs, like I said, civil society. So when you limit those spaces, when you intimidate them, when you put them in fear of breaking the law or coming under sort of more painful public attacks than usual, you're likely to tamp down political opposition. And I just think it's not entirely a coincidence that all these things happened as Israel began advancing much more seriously and vocally annexation, which in itself is an undemocratic policy. Why is it undemocratic? Well, first of all, if it happens, annexation would be done without the consent of the people whose lives will be dominated by Israel. So that in itself is undemocratic. What would be the nature of Israel after it annexes? What if Israel were to advance the idea of annexing the entire West Bank? What if it essentially breaks up, destroys the possibility of Palestinian statehood forever, convinces Israel that it's okay for Palestinians to have autonomy while being under ultimate Israeli sovereignty, but doesn't give them citizenship? Well, or even if it does give them citizenship, somehow constrains their national self-determination. If your population demographics change very dramatically, you might be concerned that a minority would demand additional rights. But if you intimidate and constrain the possibility of, and intimidate the institutions that protect minority rights, like the courts and civil society, they don't have that space. And when you pass a law to ensure that Israel must be a Jewish state, what you're basically saying is it doesn't matter who our citizens are. This is who our country is. And so I think that, maybe the entire process wasn't put into place in order to advance annexation, but it's certainly convenient to have weaker institutions that allow opposition to anchor the national identity in a constitutional level basic law ahead of something that will change the demographics, that could change the demographics of your country. Needless to say, if annexation does take place and we have two tiers of citizens or residents, then it fundamentally continues to much more deeply damage any residual elements of Israeli democracy. I think I'd like to add one thing, that Israel, for all of its flaws, for all of its non-democratic nature, and if democracy is a spectrum, I'm not sure how high a mark I would give it from 0 to 100. But I do think that Israel is strong on one thing, and that is democratic practice. I think Israelis have a tradition of democratic practice, free and fair elections, civic participation. And I don't think we should look at this as a lost cause, but rather that we have the responsibility, because we know what democratic practice is, to ensure that it continues, including if Israel adds, a large portion to its population who have not been able to participate up until now.
I appreciate you sort of ending on a positive spin as to how we can find an opportunity.
It's just an observation.
Democratic practice.
I mean, I know it sounds like I'm trying to be hopeful, but it really, from a political analyst and political observer and political science perspective, Israel does have many indicators of a strong democracy. All you need to do is read Freedom House ratings. Mm-hmm. It may be eroding, but it's still stronger than many other countries, and I think that means that there is a responsibility to do something to use that.
I agree. Before I turn it over to the several questions that we've received from our viewers, I would also like for you to touch on sort of how annexation is, what are the implications that annexation has on Israel in the international arena? And also, in addition to that, addressing also how the danger that it poses to international norms and US credibility as well. So it's sort of a big question, but I really would love for you to touch on that before moving to the open Q&A.
Yeah, it's a very important question because, first of all, I've done a lot of research on it, so that makes it important. But also because I think that the real reason is that what I'm noticing reading some of the right-wing and religious press, the newspapers and the commentators and the opinion formers who are driving the pro-annexation debate, one of the most remarkable was like a long magazine that was an insert into, I think, the weekend paper, probably of Makor Rishon, which is an important, probably the highest level religious paper in this country. And the whole page was devoted to the idea that annexing will improve Israel's international relations. So I don't know how to justify that case, but I think that annexation is an egregious violation of international law. There can be no real argument that what Israel's planning to do is not annexation. I've written about that, and as we speak, the only distraction I just had was to approve the publication of another article debunking that idea. This is annexation, and it is against international law, no matter what you call it. And that, as we've seen from every major international body, the UN, the EU, lawmakers in specific countries, international jurists, international legal figures, there's no disagreement that this is a violation and that Israel will be punished for it. Now, what that punishment will mean is highly debatable. I think it will be very finely tuned to the severity of the actual policy. So Netanyahu is nothing if not knowledgeable about how the international system works. He is extremely realistic and extremely aware of the international tenets prohibiting the acquisition of territory by force, and I'm sure he can recite every Security Council and UNGA resolution for you. And the fact is that Israel has essentially, in the scope of the few limited cases of annexation since the Second World War, I say limited, you can count, depending on how you count them, maybe 8 or 10, most of them not openly declared, right? And very few of them openly declared, maybe 5 or so, roughly. The other ones are sort of creeping annexation or occupations that might become annexation. All of them have elicited a response from the international community. The response ranges from declarations of condemnation, declarations of non-recognition, but no real punishment, to full-out war. Okay, nobody's talking about war here. The reasons for the war, and that was the first Gulf War, when Iraq not only invaded but annexed Kuwait. The reasons for the Gulf War went well beyond the declaration that Iraq was annexing. They had to do much more with the invasion itself and with U.S. interests. So I'm not going to get into that. But the more extreme and more realistic version is the severe sanctions regime against Russia for its annexation of Crimea and the invasion, not yet annexation, of eastern Ukraine, which we don't know if it will become annexation. But the combined punishment has been very severe, and there's a big in-between ground of punishing Israel through trade relations, reducing favorable trade status and tax regulations, labeling issues with relation to the EU, or what the EU calls a differentiation policy of making sure that any goods imported into the EU from the settlements are much more clearly distinguished, again, losing maybe some of the favorable tax status they might have, tax and trade status. And Israel has only barely seen any of those measures implemented up until now. And the way I look at it, whatever Israel does to openly advance annexation would push the international community to raise the punishments by 1 degree. Okay, don't think we're looking at anything as severe as the punishment of Russia, simply because there is realpolitik at play. The world doesn't have as much of an interest in punishing Israel in the way it did Russia. That's the reality. America won't let it happen. But I do think that any country that has the leeway to do it will turn up the pressure. Most likely, the EU will cut off the funds for 2020 Horizon projects beyond what it has already done, which is limiting them to inside the Green Line from 2013. We will see more implementation of, mostly those trade-related agreements that will be punished, and very severe condemnations, which are already out there. I don't know how much further it could go, but there's lots of room for international pressure before you get to the kind of thing Russia has seen. And the other point that I would make is that Israelis are now really driving home the point, and I would say this isn't just a left-wing narrative, that it will severely, put severe strain on the relationship with Jordan. Egypt has kept surprising, oddly quiet, I guess, but it will also pressure, the evolving relations with the Gulf states. We've been very aware of that, because the Gulf states themselves have expressed that's what's going to happen. So I think all of those are at play.
So I want to talk about I want to start like addressing the questions that have come from our viewers, and I'm going to sort of combine two questions because we have many. One is from Michael Musikant. I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly, talking about the Palestinian announcement or the letter that they sent to the quartet, restating their commitment to negotiations along certain lines, and what could be at stake here. What is the rationale? And then a question that we received also from Molly Freeman, asking about, do you think, ironically, that annexation could actually strengthen the international standing of Palestinians as Israeli standing falls? So I'd love if you could talk about what has just come out in the news recently about the Palestinians, which essentially is sort of I guess a restatement of a news item from prior this month. But yeah, please.
I don't really think that if Israel rolls this back, it will be because of that letter. Honestly, I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn, but since this whole debate became much more real over the last year, I have never believed that it would be what I call a bombastic annexation. When I say bombastic, I mean Jordan Valley, all settlements, all of Area C, obviously not, or even the 30%. And the reason is, like I said, or maybe I should make this clear if I haven't said it yet. Israel has been much more, has been successful in general annexing, but largely in the West Bank through quiet, undeclared, creeping, physical, legal, and sort of psychological normalization over the years. That is what has brought us to this situation. I think Netanyahu is a master of plausible deniability. Now, it's strange because anybody can see how firmly entrenched Israel is in the West Bank. The international community knows it as well. The international community has started to speak out against it. Resolution 2334 condemned the settlements for that reason. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruling against the separation wall in 2004, pointed out that the wall was was affecting de facto annexation, etc. The international community knows this. But until Israel declared it, it was basically getting away with it with very little by way of repercussions that actually hurt. And I think Netanyahu is a master of that tactic and would have preferred to continue like that, and essentially got pushed, I don't want to say pushed into it. I think he decided to try to leverage the issue in a cutthroat political environment, knowing that he could maneuver it so that he wouldn't actually have to do it. And therefore, especially after I wrote the paper looking at the range of possible international reactions, I thought to myself, he'll prefer to go back to the plausible deniability, or if anything, he'll do something symbolic like annex Ma'ale Adumim, or start building in the area of E1 between, that connects Jerusalem to Ma'ale Adumim, without making any declaration at all, just to show to the right that he's doing what he wants to do, but show the international community that he's not really annexing. Maybe Gush Etzion. I mean, there's been talk of that kind of thing. And so I think that, to my mind, this was predictable to begin with. Other political commentators have been predicting this as well. So I don't really think it, unfortunately, nothing that Netanyahu really does so far has reflected there's no evidence in my mind that he's directly responding to anything the Palestinians have done. He's doing what he has wanted to do, or what he thinks Israel should do, completely irrespective of Palestinian moves. I will say that Palestinians, I think, have been doing a lot of talking and thinking in various forums that I've sometimes been involved in. And, the idea is really prominent right now of that, should they give a response of their own vision for what should happen now, given that they reject the Trump plan, and they have, no longer in contact with the American government. There's lots of talk about should they put their own plan on the table. And I think that maybe there's some pressure internally to show initiative at least, but I can't say that's the reason. Does it improve the Palestinians' international standing? Unfortunately, I don't think so. In other words, the Palestinians have enjoyed international support for self-determination for years. There have been numerous UN resolutions about that, numerous resolutions in support of two states as a concept, numerous resolutions favoring, demanding that Israel protect their human rights. Again, ICJ rulings in their favor. International institutions have tried to protect the Palestinians. And I think there's, global sentiment is hard to assess as a single unit. But I think there's a broad understanding that the Palestinian people are not free and they should be free, if I can put it in crude terms. And on the Israeli-Jewish side, Israeli and Jewish side, there's a sense that they're Palestinians, and if they would stop being mean to Israel, maybe they could be free one day. And then there's a much more fringe, a much more limited section that says they should never be a people, but that's really, I think, a rather small portion. So I think that in terms of international support, the Palestinians basically have it. But the problem is, nobody is unaware of their problematic leadership right now. Their leadership is problematic, ineffective, enjoys very low support and legitimacy at home, and is divided. And so I don't think any of that is strengthened by Israel's annexation.
Thank you. And we just had a webinar that I encourage anyone who missed it. You can go to our JStream website and see the webinar that we had Thursday last week with Khalil Shikaki discussing the public opinion polls that he has conducted, as just very timely polls just recently regarding Palestinian public opinion and annexation. I want to ask Ken Barnes' question. What, if anything, is the effect on Netanyahu's decision-making process when American politicians, including members of Congress, we've just seen 191 members of Congress signing on a letter opposing annexation, warn Israel of consequences if he moves forward with the annexation?
Yeah. I mean, there's no question that what happens in the Trump administration is, I think, probably the only thing he's listening to. I think that he took on a bit of I wish there was there's probably a German word for, something that you think is going to be politically expedient, that has dangers, but you think you can control. If anybody knows what that is, that's what I think that's how he sees annexation. And, in his maneuvering to control this dangerous force that he is hoping he can use has been using to his benefit over the course of the year, I think the main factor that influences Netanyahu is what goes on inside the Trump administration, how supportive, how divided, how clear, etc. I don't know to what extent Netanyahu counted on the backlash against Democrats, but he's a savvy political analyst himself. He could not have been unaware of the fact that the Democratic Party for several years has been going in taking more assertive, critical position on Israeli issues. He, no doubt in my mind, was following, Bernie Sanders' very critical and open tone on this stuff. I have no doubt that he's reading surveys of young Americans, of Democratic identified Americans, and of young American Jews and where they stand. He cannot have had any illusions that this would have been very divisive and sensitive in the American Jewish community and in the American Democratic politics. So I don't know if that has an effect because he was surprised by it, or if it is having the effect that I talked about before, of giving him an excuse to roll back the policy in what we call a game in Hebrew. We have this term of the game of hold me back, when you don't really want to fight because you're afraid of the bully, but you want to show that you're really courageous. So you pretend you're going to fight, but you hope that somebody kind of holds you back. And I think that he could be using this backlash from the Democratic Party as part of the case that he's now making to the Israeli public about why we have to downplay this whole thing.
I think that's very helpful. I want to ask the question here about assuming annexation moves forward in a limited capacity of international punishment. What is the real option for Palestinians at this point in time in that scenario?
The real option, I mean, I don't know what real really means. I think that Palestinians have for a long time already been talking about a rights-based scenario in which they completely give up on the idea of advocating any particular constitutional framework for a resolution, and simply start from the perspective of basic human and civil rights for anybody living either under Israeli direct sovereignty. They could also decide that they are now effectively living under Israeli control much more openly, no matter what, even if they're formally in the annexation area or not. There is certainly the option of, further weakening or collapse of the Palestinian Authority. I've been discussing this with my Palestinian colleagues who claim that the Palestinian Authority will not voluntarily dismantle, but the situation might be already set into motion, by which the Palestinian Authority either collapses or loses so much authority that is no longer relevant. And in that case, again, that brings Palestinians back to a decision about whether they advocate a rights struggle or try to build some sort of new political body that consolidates their political efforts, which I have heard some Palestinians talking about, but it's not really clear to me how fast that can happen, considering Palestinian politics has been very atrophied and suppressed in many ways by the Palestinian Authority in recent years. So, there's no plan for succession of Abu Mazen as far as I can tell or gather. There's no plan for what happens if the PA is so weak that it gets to the point of collapse. And it's worrying because it could lead to a measure of chaos. The Palestinian Authority, as most people know on this call, I'm sure, has already, cut off security cooperation in ways that are more concrete than it ever has in previous threats. So I think that is actually quite a dangerous moment, even though support for an armed struggle in polls, and my colleague Khalil Shikaki has a recent poll, and I'm sure I think he spoke to you recently, a couple days ago. So that support for an armed struggle has gone up, but I still don't see it as kind of an overriding, aspect of the zeitgeist right now in the Palestinian Authority, despite those numbers. The first choice is still for unarmed or peace agreement, non-military strategies. So, but I would say it's a very tenuous position. All of these, as you can tell, are not terribly concrete plans for what Palestinians could do.
And I'm curious as to what you think could be constructive policies that could be put forward by the international community in response to a potential limited annexation, or any annexation for that matter. What are the types of things that you would find to actually move things forward in a constructive manner?
So if there is an annexation, what should the international community do? I mean, I think that the international community should first of all decide what the longer term goal is, right? For one thing, no annexation should be acceptable, right? The international system, and I've tried to argue this, it's not just about Israel-Palestine. The prohibition on territorial conquest is a mainstay of the post-war international system. It is being eroded by examples like this, and the international community should find ways to punish and deter. But with relation to this conflict, I think the international community should and there is no one international community. I suppose we're really talking about America and Western European countries. I think they need to decide, like, what is the longer term goal before you think of a strategy to get there. And if the longer term goal is to get to some sort of negotiated, agreed final status resolution, a comprehensive agreement, without being necessarily, wedded to the old formula of a hard two-state partition or whatever, I think the formulas of the past haven't worked. And so I would say the international community should set the long-term goal of reviving the idea that Palestinians have a right to self-determination on that territory, and any moves that make that impossible should be stopped and punished, of encouraging the two sides to get back to some sort of a process. But if they can't do that now, each one should, I think the international community should respond to each side in ways that will strengthen their position for future negotiations. What does that mean? Well, I personally think Israel's international position will be stronger if it doesn't annex. I think Israel's society will be stronger if it doesn't annex. So I know that's a tough love approach, but it's an obvious one. I don't have any magic bullet. I think the ways to deter Israel are, American conditionality on its aid, punishments through trade regulations with European countries. Those are the obvious ways to deter Israel. And on the Palestinian side, I think that they will be in a better position for any future negotiation and for any future state building, no matter what kind of state it is. If they, first of all, think about real leadership, reconstructing democratic institutions and practice, and economic development. Alongside, I'm going to give props to EcoPeace here. My colleague Gidon Bromberg has really done great work on looking at how very urgent, immediate needs, now we all know because of Corona, but both economic and environmental urgent needs require and drive a much deeper level of cooperation between Israel and Palestine and the Palestinians in order to, at least make the kind of progress that the Palestinian society needs to be closer to Israel's level of economic development, infrastructure development, environmental and resource management. The better the Palestinians do on those aspects, and the better it does on reconstructing its democratic institutions, democratic practice, a leadership success, a real process of leadership succession, the better placed it will be to both negotiate and implement any agreement. Whether the agreement is a two-state partition, an open border two-state confederation, or a single democratic state, which doesn't seem very likely or desirable, but maybe in between solutions like a federation or, you know, what am I trying to say? Canton approaches, all these creative approaches, the Palestinians will be better positioned to do any of them if they're able to take those kinds of steps that I said, and they require very deep cooperation with Israel to do those things. That in itself could drive more goodwill. And I do not mean to suggest that we should put on hold reaching a final status agreement and ending military occupation. The reality is that it may not be possible now, politically.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left, and so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to ask very many questions, and very many more questions. But there's...
Before we end, I just want to say, please send them to me if you can when this is over, so I can at least see them.
Okay, so I do want to. I mean, we have 3 minutes, and there's one last question tying back into the concept of Israeli democracy, and Andrew Miller is asking, beyond annexation, do you see Netanyahu and others taking any additional steps to erode Israeli democracy in the near future? I'm wondering if you can answer that in 2 minutes.
Well, sure, because all of the things I mentioned have already happened. I mean, there are at least two specific laws that constrain the activity of left-leaning civil society organizations that are tailored to address particularly left-wing civil society groups. There are other right-wing civil society groups who, through the legal structure of how NGOs work, are allowed to operate without practically any oversight over their funding at all. So they have an advantage while the law disadvantages the kinds of civil society groups that express political opposition. The nation-state law is already in place, and various other laws that discriminate against the Palestinian Arab minority. I think the most obvious one is further attacks on the judiciary, because what we're seeing is the attempts to pass an override law are still there. They've sort of taken a backseat for now, but remember, that was one of the major reasons why the coalition negotiations collapsed back in May of 2019, because there were some parties that were insisting on having an override clause and others who opposed it. And I think that, you know, we don't, right now, it looks like we're in a slightly better position because the Justice Ministry is currently held by somebody from Gantz's party. But, you know, the forces that have completely adopted the narrative that, you know, the judiciary is somehow against the Israeli people and against democracy, which is a really, you know, manipulated understanding of how democracy works, are still very strong. And I think that the major attacks are going to come against that, which, you know, if they manage to erode the power of the Supreme Court and delegitimize the judicial proceeding, you know, the judiciary at large, well, then you see, like, you know, a country that's ripe for consolidation of executive power with no checks on it.
And I hate to end on on a scary scary note, but I do think that it's very important for people to understand really what is at stake here with Israel's democracy. And I know that all of our viewers, I'm going to try to get the questions for you, Dahlia. I think, again, that you just exemplified for us, you know, your versatility, your ability to touch on a broad spectrum of issues, especially your comments regarding the policies that could be constructive for the future. And I know that you've written a paper about that, so for the Century Foundation, so we can also find a way to send that link to those that are interested. So please do contact us if you are interested in reading that paper. So I really want to thank you so much, as always, for enlightening us, helping us understand, breaking things down in a really clear and concise way that only you are really able to do. And to say to all of our viewers that we do have 2 other webinars on this topic this week. Tomorrow we have a webinar with Senator Chris Van Hollen, Representative Jen Schakowsky, member of Knesset Nitzan Horowitz, and member of Knesset Ofer Shelach, talking about Israeli and American legislators that have been outspoken in their opposition to annexation. And on Thursday, we have a webinar with Jeremy Ben-Ami and Daniel Levy, also discussing some of the things that Dahlia has touched on, which is policies, potential policies that could be proposed if annexation does move forward. So I encourage everyone to sign up for those webinars this week, to stay tuned. And thank you again for being with us, Dahlia, and to all of our viewers for signing in.
Thank you for having me as always.
Thanks, Dahlia.